let's discuss about the strategy design pattern. This is another behavioral design pattern in object-oriented programming. So as you can see in the definition, there is a bunch of information are provided and it's collected from the Wikipedia. So let's get through it a little bit and then we discuss uh, further. So what it says is that in computer programming, the strategy pattern is a behavioral software design pattern that enables selecting an algorithm at runtime. So basically, this is what you need to know about this design pattern. Okay. So basically, if you have to choose or if you have multiple tasks or among those, only one of those will be selected for the output, then this design pattern comes into play. So I think you understand what I mean. So study lets the algorithm vary independently from clients that use it. That means client just wants something. Let's say I want to export a data in PDF format. There are under the hood there are implementation for all different sorts of file export, for example PDF, XLS, CSV, JSON, you name it. But based on the client input, client request, the algorithm decides which one to choose and which algorithm to execute. So this is basically pretty much it. Okay. So I have collected the UML class diagram as well as the sequence diagram from the Wikipedia as well. This is the Wikipedia version of these things. Later on, I'm going to define my own based on the tasks or the goals I set for this demonstration. So basically what's happening here is that there is um, interface which is called here strategy, and the context which actually executes this algorithm uses this interface, and then there are a couple of implementation classes here. So whenever client sends a request to this context, it actually uh, decides which one of these two has to execute based on the request sent to it. So this is it. This is all about this design pattern. So here is, as you can see, the same thing in the sequence diagram. Whenever a request is sent to this context, an algorithm is processing the request and returning the result based on the request sent to the context. So this is another Wikipedia version of the class diagram. It's showing that the context and strategy has a composition relationship, and there is nothing wrong with that. So let's set a goal for this demonstration. So let's create an export service which will export file based on the request format. For example, there will be let's say there are different types of format, right? PDF, XLS, JSON, you name it. So the goal of this demonstration is that, let's say client wants PDF format data. So he sends the request to the controller or processor or the context that I want a PDF format data, and the processor executes the regarding algorithm and returns back the desired format data to the client. So this is the this is the goal of this demonstration. So let's do it step by step. Okay, so this is the UML diagram of the strategy pattern we are gonna implement in this demonstration. So we have the export service interface here, which has one abstract method, which is export, and this interface has been implemented by three concrete classes, and each one of these has its own uh, implemented algorithm of the function export. And this export service context actually using this interface, and it also has the export function which decides which algorithm is going to execute during the runtime based on the uh, input that is going, or data or request that is going to be provided by the client end. And for this demonstration, actually this export service controller and export service enum, these are absolutely optional, but I tried to, or wanted to, make it more abstract so that the client end or the client side does not need to know much of these implementation details. So due to this abstraction factor, I added these two things here. Obviously this enum or enumeration class, enum class contains the some, what would I say, some information about the formats, for example PDF, XLS, CSV, text, JSON, so on and so forth. And this controller actually takes the request from the client and then sends this request to the export service context, which then decides which request is going to, I mean, which algorithm has to be executed based on this request, and then sends it back to the export service controller. And then client obviously gets the output based on the input. So this is basically it. So in the next section, we are gonna check the sequence diagram of this strategy pattern. This is the sequence diagram for the strategy pattern. So let's say we have the client application here, which sends a request for specific data export. So this what happens is that this controller class accepts that request and forwards it to the export service context, which then decides itself during the runtime which specific data to be exported. So it calls the specific implementation of the export service and then returns the output to the client application. So the same thing happens as well for the XLS file. When the request is sent from the client application, it's forwarded to the export service context, and then this context export implementation decides during the runtime which one to choose, or which concrete implementation to choose during the runtime, and then returns back the output, sends back the output to the client application. So this is basically the sequence flow of this strategy pattern. As you can see, this algorithm selection is happening right here. Okay, so export service context is deciding based on the input which one to choose and which one to execute during the runtime. So this is basically the concept of um, strategy pattern. So let's implement this now. So first let's create one Java project, give it a name strategy, and I'm not gonna create any module for this demonstration. Let's create one package. Let's create an interface first, give it a name I export service, and which will have one abstract method export, and explicitly let's define this as the functional interface. Now let's create some implementing class. First one to be PDF, and which is going to implement the export service. And let's print some here, some information here. For example, PDF is exported. So I'm going to uh, declare the constructor here, even though it's absolutely optional since we have kept it in the UML diagram. So I'm gonna mention it here as well. So let's copy this one, create another class, Excel, or probably XLS, XL, and paste the code here, change it to XLS, and also change it here, and create another one called CSV, and paste the code again. Change the class name and the other information here. So now we have the implemented classes. So now let's create the export service context class. So my export service context, which is going to use the export service interface. And we're also going to define one extra export function here, which is going to use this export service and call the export function from that interface. And that is pretty much it. Let's try to execute this. Create an executable file. Let's give it a name main and create the main function. So this client class, let's call the context, export service context. And create a new instance of it. And try to export this CSV file from here. Call the export from export service context. And let's copy this couple more times. Let's do this XLS and do this for CSV. And so let's execute this. Okay, so I guess there is, okay, so let's give it PDF so that we have different information for each call. Okay, so basically this implementation is working fine. So as you can see, we have the export service context class. The client is basically relying on this context class instead of the service and the service implementation. So this context class, what it's doing is that it has that information about this export. Okay, so based on the request sent from the client, it is actually returning the relevant um, export or doing the relevant export. So I want to make it a little better. For example, instead of knowing about the context, let's assign this task to the controller. So for this one, I'm gonna create a controller class, which is going to be a export service controller. which is definitely going to use the export service context. Let's make it static, and it is going to take one parameter that is going to be export type, which doesn't exist yet. So let's create it. It's going to be of type enumeration. So let's create one enum export type, and it's going to have CSV, PDF, XLS, let's say JSON, add few more, JSON, TXT, so on and so forth. So based on this, let's do some validation here. For example, I'm gonna take this implementation from here to the controller class, and I'm doing some validation here. For example, if type dot type is equal to export type dot CSV, then this thing is called. And also I'm gonna do else if then I'm gonna do it XLS, do this again. I'm doing it else if PDF, do this, and then we are gonna, if none found, let's do some messaging here. Requested format not found, and here let's provide the format type we are trying to export, and also let's quick check if type is null. We are not gonna process the request any further, so it's gonna return. Okay, so this is pretty much what I can think of. Let's get back to the client class and call this export service controller dot export type dot uh, CSV. let's let's TXT, put some JSON, then XLS, then what else we have, PDF. So now if we execute this, so here we can see that request format not found text, request format not found JSON, but other format has been found. Okay, so CSV is exported, XLS is PDF is exported. So this is pretty much it. I think you have understood the point of strategy pattern. So that is pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Peace out.